Okay, let's get started. Welcome everybody today. Before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to our Spanish interpreter, Erika Perez. Erika, take it away.
Hola a todos, vamos a empezar. Mi nombre es Erika Pérez. El día de hoy la reunión va a estar interpretado al español. Ustedes van a ver un globito ahí a la par donde dice reactions, la carita feliz. Hacer clic en ese globito y seleccionar español. También para los que hablan inglés, pero también tienen la opción de escuchar el audio original y la interpretación si quieren. So for monolingual speakers, this meeting will be bilingual, and you'll see a little globe right at the bottom of your screen next to reactions. Click on that, choose English, because right now you can hear me, but soon once I click OK on the invitation, you won't be able to hear me unless you click English or Spanish. Thank you.
Thank you, Erika. So we're going to launch the function, so it should pop up on your screen shortly. Please remember, everyone must select a language so that we can continue to hear Erika as she switches from one language to the other. So I'm just going to give everybody a couple seconds to select their language.
What? I don't get it.
At the bottom of your screen, you can click on the little globe symbol to select English.
Oh, okay, thank you.
No problem. All right. Okay, let's get going. So a couple more instructions so that you know what to expect during today's meeting and how to use the Zoom interface. I'm going to be speaking slowly to allow the interpretation in Spanish to be done easily. So today we're going to have a presentation followed by breakout discussions and an opportunity for you to share your comments. During the presentation portion, all microphones will be muted. If you are experiencing technical issues or if you have a clarifying question about something that was said in the presentation, please let us know using the chat function. That's at the bottom of your screen and you can click on chat. You can also let us know that you're having an issue or you can ask a question by raising your hand. To raise your hand, click on participants, then click on raise your hand in the pop-up window. You can do that either by hovering on your name and clicking on the button that pops up or at the bottom of the pop-up window. Just so you know that we are recording this meeting, the recording is going to include the presentation, any questions or answers that we received during the meeting, and the report outs from the breakout discussions at the end. We are not recording the breakout sessions. If you do not wish to be recorded during the meeting, please make sure to turn off your microphone and camera and keep them off at any time. Just to go over today's agenda, so we're going to have a quick round of introductions just so that you know who's speaking on the call today. Then we're going to have a presentation to the whole group, and time allowing, we'll have a little bit of time for some quick questions and answers. Then we'll have some breakout discussions, which you signed up for when you registered for the meeting. And then finally, we'll have some report outs from the different breakout discussions, and we'll share next steps. So quickly, my name is Kat Eschel. Maybe you saw me during the first open house. I am the City of Boston's Carbon Neutrality Program Manager. I work in the Environment Department. You will probably also hear from Allison Brazias, our Director of Climate and Environmental Planning, who's kind of managing the back end of this Zoom call. I'm also joined today by Andrea Atkinson, the Executive Director of One Square World, and Philip Ish Gates, a Senior Associate with Synapse Energy Economics. And then today's interpretation services are provided by Erika Perez, who you heard from at the beginning. In terms of who's facilitating the breakout discussions, you signed up for these when you registered for the meeting. Ben Silverman and Philip will be leading the breakout talking about how we decarbonize buildings. Brenda Pike will be leading the breakout discussion about financing retrofits. Allison will stay in the main room with anybody who wanted to have a little bit more of a deeper discussion about the technical analysis. And then myself and Andrea will be in a breakout discussion talking about how we can best design for equity in this policy. So now into the main presentation. So in this presentation, we're going to recap the policy concept and our goals. We're also going to share a little bit of what we heard at the first open house. Then we're going to have an update from the technical advisory group and the technical analysis, and then an update from the residential advisory group. So a quick recap of the policy. So we're gathered here today because action is needed. Carbon emissions are changing our climate and causing sea level rise, extreme heat, and stormwater flooding in Boston. These effects are already being seen today, and we know that it's going to get worse. We also know that buildings in Boston account for 70% of our emissions. We also know that our emissions are not decreasing fast enough. So we need to accelerate the rate at which we are reducing carbon emissions. And there are three main ways that you do that. The first is through energy efficiency. The second is by electrifying nearly everything that currently runs on fossil fuels to run on electricity. And the third strategy is to buy clean energy. Right now, we do have a policy that's already operating in the building sector. That policy is called the Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance, which we call BERDO for short, because otherwise that's a mouthful. So in BERDO, buildings over 35,000 square feet or 35 units are required to report their annual energy and water usage to the city each year. Energy Star Portfolio Manager is an online platform that calculates the carbon emissions from that energy, and then the city takes all of that and discloses that data publicly each year. Then after 5 years of being covered by this policy, buildings must have taken some sort of action. They have a lot of options. They can reduce their energy usage or their emissions. They can be certified as a highly efficient building, or they can perform an energy audit, among just a few of the options that they have. There are also a lot of statewide programs currently in operation that all support energy efficiency, like Mass Save, which some of you may have benefited from and which we all pay into on our energy bills. So the policy that we're talking about today was one of the high priority policies highlighted in the 2019 Climate Action Plan update. It corresponds to strategy number 5 to develop an emissions performance standard to decarbonize existing large buildings. The reasons why this policy was identified as a high priority was because it directly targets our largest source of emissions. So buildings in Boston account for 70% of our emissions, and then the BERDO buildings, those big buildings that report, account for about half of that chunk. So it's a lot of emissions for relatively few buildings. It also would give buildings flexibility in meeting short to long-term targets, and it would allow building owners to choose when they make different investments or different choices in order to hit their targets. In terms of the components, the policy pieces that make up a performance standard, one would be carbon targets that decrease over time and that are adapted according to different types of buildings, because a lab has a different energy profile than a multifamily apartment building. We're also exploring lowering the threshold of the policy. BERDO, if you remember, applies to buildings that are over 35,000 square feet. What if we lowered that to 20,000 square feet and covered more buildings? We're also looking at trying to study all the different pathways that buildings could take to hit carbon targets. This includes things like retrofits of buildings, so renovations and energy efficiency work, electrification of buildings, things like renewable energy purchases, and exploring something like an alternative compliance payment. If a building almost makes it to their target, but not quite, can they instead pay into a fund that would then potentially fund other efficiency work elsewhere? So what this means from a policy standpoint is that we're essentially keeping one part of BERDO, the annual reporting requirement, and sort of making sure it's up to date. And then we're taking the current energy action and assessment requirement, so that requirement where every 5 years buildings have to do something, and turning it into a building emissions performance standard. So a standard that sets carbon targets by building type that decrease over time, building in a stronger equity focus, and doing things like setting up rules for off-site renewable purchases or offsets, among many of the topics that we're exploring in this policy. So this slide shows who's working in this and who's involved in this process. So the project team is the City of Boston, which is leading the development and the writing really of this policy. We're then working closely with two teams. One team, which is Synapse Energy Economics on the technical analysis side, and then working with One Square World and Alternatives for Community and Environment on the resident advisory group, and really helping to center impacted communities in the design of this policy. So then we have two advisory groups, a technical advisory group, which is a lot of wonks and smart people helping to inform the analysis that's sort of resulting in developing carbon targets, identifying building pathways to get to those targets, and analyzing what the costs of meeting those targets would be. We then have a resident advisory group, which is discussing policy principles and is all about making sure that we're maximizing opportunities for residents and working to make this a policy that results in better health outcomes. We also are meeting with a lot of people, sort of with dedicated meetings to sort of hear people and their specific concerns in focus groups. So focus groups with people like building owners, tenants, with labor, and lots of different people in focus groups. And then making sure that we're providing an opportunity for everyone who's interested to participate in open houses like today's open house. In terms of project timeline, here's where we're at. So since last year, we've been hard at work. The technical advisory group started meeting in March and has had 5 meetings so far, with a 6th one scheduled in October. And then the resident advisory group has had 2 meetings so far, with its 3rd meeting scheduled for November. And in terms of our hopes is that the technical analysis will be complete in November, and that by December we have a final policy proposal. So now I want to summarize a little bit of what we heard in July, which was really, it was the first open house where we wanted to just introduce everyone to the concept of a building performance standard and give people a sense of what the process to develop it would be, and just give you an opportunity to ask us questions and share your concerns. So in terms of the sort of, we heard a lot of sort of similar questions that could be batched into types of questions. So there were a lot of questions about building decarbonization, what electrifying a building looks like, how institutional buildings can electrify, asking about case studies. And so that's why our first breakout today is all about how to decarbonize a building. We heard a lot of questions about the impact on residents, how this is going to affect housing quality, how this might interplay with displacement and the affordability crisis, and what kinds of jobs could be generated and who's going to bear the cost of doing this work. So our second breakout is going to be around designing for equity and trying to get a little deeper into these questions. And the third breakout is around financing. So how do we finance this work? How does this fit into a building's investment or financing cycles? What new financing options can we imagine? How can we better use the financing options that we already have? And so the third breakout today is going to be getting into those questions and about financing retrofits. And then finally, there was a batch of, well, not finally, there was a batch of technical questions around carbon targets, site and source emissions, the cost benefit analysis. What about buildings that have multiple uses? and what does a timeline for compliance look like? And so we wanted to give you a deeper update on the technical analysis in the main presentation today, and then give you an opportunity to go a little deeper in a breakout, which is just an extended opportunity to ask questions about the technical analysis. There were also a lot of policy specific questions, and we're gonna make sure that we really dive into those in the next open house. So a lot of questions about understanding what the source of legal authority is, talking about exemptions and waivers, talking about enforcement, different incentives, a lot of different questions that we don't quite have answers to yet, but definitely want to make sure that we have enough time to really dive into them at the next open house. We also heard some other concerns and opportunities. So a lot of concerns around the potential impact on residents, but also the opportunities in terms of buildings that are in need of efficiency that need this work to be done. Concerns about the strength of enforcement, what it would mean to lower the threshold to 20,000 square feet for building managers that might already be strapped for time and might not know how to do this work. How are we going to help them along? Some concern about building technology and whether it performs well enough, about city capacity, about transparency, about accountability. And then a lot of opportunities. So a lower threshold also means that more buildings are covered, more buildings are retrofit, more buildings are electrified. That benefits more people. An opportunity as well around regional collaboration. So with our neighbors to the north, Somerville and Cambridge, but also with all of the cities in the Metro Mayors Coalition, Central Boston. Opportunities related to education and training, as well as good jobs. So now I'm gonna hand it over to Philip from Synapse to give us a little bit more of an update on the technical advisory group. Philip, take it away and just let me know when you want me to advance slides.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kat. So the city has convened this technical advisory group, the WONCs that Kat mentioned earlier. And this is a group consisting of experts in building science, architecture, engineering, construction, building operations, energy policy, renewable energy sustainability, and more. It's a really a powerhouse of local wisdom that will be helpful in helping the city design this policy. And we at Synapse are assisting with the technical analysis and facilitating these group meetings. The TAG, Technical Advisory Group, is providing expertise on a number of fronts, helping to advise as the city sets the carbon performance metrics and targets. We're also helping to develop retrofit strategies and identify the costs associated with them, and help the city think through what are appropriate ways that offsite renewable energy and offsets can be used to balance or reduce the emissions on-site associated in these buildings. And the TAG is also pulling together data and case studies spanning a range of topics that will help as the policy moves towards implementation. We have met 5 times since March, and we will be concluding the technical analysis by November. We expect to have one more full technical advisory group meeting. Next slide, please. So we have essentially a 4-step process. We began by analyzing the existing data from BERDO, developing some descriptive statistics and visualizing the data in a way that we can understand how and why buildings are performing better or worse, which building types constitute the highest consumption of energy and emissions, and what are the relevant factors in determining or defining those energy use and emissions. And we have used that data to then begin developing building use typologies that essentially differentiate buildings by their end uses, what's happening inside them. So you might have education buildings, which are different than healthcare buildings, which are different than office buildings, etc. The next step is developing and proposing net zero carbon performance policy and a framework for that policy. So the key component to this is the building emissions performance targets, and we're going to have a closer look at those in a few slides here. But those are essentially targets that these buildings would have to hit by the different type of buildings would have to hit those in different milestone years out to 2050. And then forecasting the emission reductions that we expect to see from this policy. And as Kat mentioned, we are also evaluating what is the appropriate size threshold of building for this policy to apply to. Does it remain at the 35,000 threshold, or does it come down to 20,000? The next step is identifying pathways to decarbonization for these buildings. And so that involves getting into a detailed look at the end use energy and emissions in the buildings by the different building types. And when we say end use energy and emissions, we're thinking about things like space heating, water heating, cooling, lighting, all of the different types of equipment systems that use energy in buildings. And then we identify strategies to reduce the emissions associated with each of those different end uses and different equipment systems. So we're assessing the technical potential for bringing down the emissions. And then finally, assessing the impact of alternative energy, renewable energy offsets, how that can help buildings to achieve this decarbonization. And the fourth and final step is estimating the cost of the performance standard. What is it going to take for these buildings to get to net zero carbon, and on an individual basis, and then as a portfolio, all the buildings across Boston. Next slide, please. So here's a glimpse into some of our end use analysis. We're looking, well, we begin with the fuels, and you see here in this figure, the leftmost column is the total summed across all buildings. And then we have 13 individual columns for the different building types that are covered by the BERDO policy. And so we've scrutinized how energy is being used and what are the associated emissions in each of these building types. And we find that electricity accounts for over half of the end use emissions. And this is using the 2018 data, the most recent reporting year that from when we began the analysis. And then you see that natural gas is the next largest source of emissions, and followed by district heat, and finally district cooling and fuel oil use. Next slide, please. And then this figure then breaks down those fuels into the end use emissions across all of the different building types. And you can see here that the dark gray bar at the bottom, heating, is the largest source of end use emissions in these buildings. But it only accounts for about 30%. So there's a range of other end uses in these buildings that also need to be tackled. Next slide, please. In this slide, we are showing the emissions distribution across all of the different types of buildings. We have a horizontal axis that represents the square footage of buildings for each of these different building types. And so you see that in total, the buildings that are reporting under BERDO represent about close to 250 million square feet of building area. And that in the center, you see multifamily housing in that kind of teal color, and to its right in the darker blue are office buildings. Those have the greatest area. There's the most building area represented by them. And then on the vertical axis, you see the emissions intensity. That's how much emissions each of these buildings accounts for on a kind of levelized basis per square foot. And you see that certain building types tend to use more or generate more emissions than others. In particular, healthcare stands out in the darker green as a more emissions intense use of buildings. And then on the far right, the technology and science buildings. And when we look at, when we look for patterns across the different types, we see that there are some buildings, these kind of needles or spikes at the beginning of the distribution, there are a handful of buildings in each type that have relatively high emissions compared to the rest of buildings in their type. And then the curve kind of levels off gradually, and you have kind of a mid-range of buildings that fall in a similar kind of emissions profile. Next slide, please. So when reflecting upon this data, it leads us to the next step of how do we begin developing a pathway to decarbonization. And so we need to identify the technical potential for reducing emissions. And that means looking at a granular level into each building type, the characteristics of those building types, the end use energy, and the types of equipment that are within those buildings. And then identifying strategies to reduce the emissions that go along with each of those different systems. So we're looking at deep energy retrofits. How do you upgrade the thermal envelope of the building? Adding insulation, tightening up leaky envelopes, improving windows. How do you address lighting and make it more efficient? Heating, ventilation, air conditioning, water heating, refrigeration, etc. Making those end uses more efficient. And the next step is looking into electrification of those end uses in the buildings that consume fossil fuels, like space heating, water heating, and cooking, and also district energy systems, which tend to run on fossil fuels to provide heating and cooling to buildings. And then finally, looking at on-site renewable energy. How can you install solar panels on roofs or parking lots? Then we go about identifying the technical potential, estimating the performance of those existing systems and future systems, and how the retrofits or strategies can conserve energy and therefore reduce emissions. And then looking at how those different approaches interact with each other in real world in buildings, and estimating the impact that a cleaning energy grid will have on emission rates. So there are existing policies like renewable portfolio standards that require that the power grid gets cleaner over time. Well, that means that there will be fewer emissions associated with the electricity use in buildings. So we want to quantify that. And then finally, looking at the impact of green power, off-site renewable energy, or other off-sites. So for those remaining emissions, electricity use from the grid that maybe is still coming from has some carbon associated with it. Maybe it's natural gas plants. How do you offset those emissions through off-site green power purchase, for example? Next slide, please. So going through this process, we have some preliminary carbon targets that we're showing here on the screen. And as you see in big bold letters, these are draft targets and are still subject to some refinement. But essentially, for each building type, each of the 13 building types, we have identified an emissions standard target in terms of the amount of carbon emissions per square foot per year that would be allowed under the policy. And the policy would theoretically begin in the year 2025 and extend out to 2050. And by 2050, all buildings would need to be at net zero carbon. So the standard gets more stringent over time to allow building owners to make improvements over time as the equipment in their buildings comes up for replacement. So the building owners can take a phased approach, a sensible approach to getting these buildings' emissions down. And these targets have been aligned with the citywide emissions targets in the city's climate action plan. So there's a goal of 50% decarbonization by year 2030, and then of course the 100% decarbonization by year 2050. And I'd also like to note that not every building is going to fit perfectly into one of these categories. Some buildings have different use types within them. So you might have a multifamily building that has some retail or offices on the first floor. And so there's a customizable approach for mixed use buildings that would consider those different use cases that can exist in a single building. Next slide, please. So this is an illustration of how the various decarbonization strategies that we've been evaluating will impact covered buildings and develop a pathway towards decarbonization through the year 2050. So in the first vertical column, the teal bar is the 2018 emissions associated with the BERDO buildings. And then each of these strategies identified along the horizontal axis at the bottom of the figure shows a strategy or a group of strategies, and the green bar represents the emissions abatement or reduction impact that group of strategies can have. And they continue on downward towards 2050, and in gray we have the effect of the grid improving under existing policies. And that's not any action that these building owners need to take. That's something that's going to occur essentially naturally over time under the existing policy requirements at the state level or at the grid level. What we see from this analysis is that the strategies that are likely to have the greatest emissions reduction impact are electrification of the building end uses, also electrification of the district heating and cooling systems, and building envelope retrofits, insulating, tightening, reducing air leakage, and improving windows. And we also note that as the grid gets cleaner, it helps the other strategies focused around electrification. So when you're switching off of fossil fuel combustion in a building to, say, a heat pump that provides heating and cooling using electricity, the cleaner the electric grid is, the better of an effect that approach has, because the carbon emissions associated with that electricity are smaller. And grid improvement we expect will account for about 40% of the emissions reduction by year 2050 under the current policies adopted by the state and other states in New England. Next slide, please. So the last step in our technical analysis is estimating the abatement cost. What is it going to cost for building owners to get all of the buildings, the large covered buildings, under this policy to net zero carbon by 2050? So for this cost analysis, we've been really focused on ensuring that it's Boston specific, that we're using local cost estimates so we get an accurate depiction of what those real costs are going to be faced by building owners. So we're using local data for energy efficiency measures, on-site and off-site renewables, building electrification, and district thermal electrification. And where local data isn't available, we're pulling the next best thing through literature search and through looking at case studies from the region and from other relevant areas. And you can see here some of the sources that we're using in our cost analysis. So our approach involves estimating the life cycle costs of these improvements to get towards total decarbonization. So that requires forecasting what the cost of energy will be. And so we've looked at the future costs of energy by different fuel types, electricity, natural gas, fuel oil, and then district thermal systems, district heating and cooling. Next, we've quantified the life cycle costs associated with these changes in the buildings, looking at the capital investment that's required to upgrade the buildings, impacts on operation and maintenance of the buildings, costs of energy, and then procurement of offsite renewables, et cetera. And then we're rolling all of that up to estimate the net abatement cost for all of these buildings, so that there are some benefits. It's not exclusively costs, but also quantifying the benefits. So when you implement energy efficiency measures in a building, you can save energy, and that helps reduce the overall cost of getting to net zero carbon. We translate all of the fuel savings into emission savings to come up with an average cost per ton to decarbonize the buildings. And when we talk about abatement costs, that's the cost of reducing emissions. So you could, a synonymous term for that would be emissions reductions costs. Next slide, please. So we are nearing the end of the technical analysis. We have one final technical advisory group meeting that will occur likely in October, and we will wrap up this analysis by November. And we will summarize the technical advising that will help the city to develop its policy framework. We will come up with some final performance standard recommendations, those benchmarks by emissions by square foot by the different building types. And then we will finalize the cost impact estimate that I was just describing, and also identify recommendations for future study. There are some limits to what can be accomplished in this process, and there are some related areas of, that warrant some additional review, and the city will have some ongoing processes for that in the future. And so we're looking forward to concluding this phase of the technical analysis. And that covers the items I wanted to present on. Thanks again, everyone, for listening.
Okay, thank you, Philip. So now we're going to hear from Andrea Atkinson with an update about the Resident Advisory Group. And Andrea, you have up to about 10 minutes, so feel free to take your time.
Thanks, Kat. Hey, everybody. Hi, Frank. I saw you wave. Hello. I can't see everybody on my screen, but yeah. Thank you, Philip, for all that information. So essentially what the Resident Advisory Group is doing, right? It's a parallel process to the Technical Advisory Group. And our work focuses on the expertise, the lived experience and expertise of community members and residents. So the work that we're doing is to take this information. You can go back, Kat. One, if you can stay back. That way, yes. So essentially we're taking this work from the angle of what is the impact of this policy on residents? What's the impact on social patterns, for example? And so the way we also are at the same time, so as we're informing the policy from that angle, we're also interpreting and translating the policy speak, that all that stuff that you just heard, we translate that so that someone like me can understand it. And then we take all the information that from residents and translate it to the policy folks. So we kind of act as an in-between so that folks can speak the same language, because at the end of the day, a good policy for residents will be a good policy for the environment. And we believe that by intertwining the technical and the resident components and expertise, that we come up with the best possible policy. So as it says here, we're getting community expertise and feedback. We're looking at the potential impact and opportunities. So from that, we translate this information and then look at it from an impact standpoint. What does it mean, if building owners are, changing out, are doing upgrades? What does that look like from a resident's perspective? What does it look like for there to be offsets, for example? So taking all that information, kind of looking at what the future looks like from that perspective. And then we're working again with community leads, making sure that we have the right people in the room. Next slide, please. So our process has looked like, the first advisory meeting happened in July. We basically have, the point of that meeting is to say, here are all of the facts. What would be best for you? What is the impact of, building emissions on your building and you? And what are the things that you care about? And we'll talk a little bit later about what people said. From that information, we have been working again with the policy team to pull in those principles into the development of the policy. And from that, we developed some recommendations that ended up going to the resident advisory meeting 2, which happened last week. And basically the question there is this what you wanted? You know, is this the right track? Are we going down the right path? Had some really good feedback there, gave them basically all of the information that you all are learning on this call in a more kind of synthesized way. And then from there, we're going to take that and we're going to move it into the policy refinement, you know, making sure, you know, from what we heard, there's a lot of good direction happening. And there's some tweaks that we need to take into account. And as Kat said at the beginning, there are certain things that haven't been developed yet that we need to start fleshing out, right? We're at the point where we can start looking at, okay, what would a fund look like? What would, you know, what are the more detailed pieces of this that we need to look at? And then the final meeting in November is going to be about the final draft, right? And then we all know that policy doesn't end there, and that there will be a lot of push at that final piece to make sure that folks stay engaged. And one of the things that we found through this process is that there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of people being impacted by their buildings currently that could benefit from a lot of the programs that are out there already. So making these connections, that sort of thing. So that's what's been going on from that side. Next slide, please. So this is essentially how we've presented it. We've been looking at this as an equation. And the big goal being that large buildings must reduce emissions, and it has to have the greatest benefit and least harm to Boston residents, like actual people that are living in Boston need to benefit. And so we put it into this equation, right? So we bring down the fossil fuels, right, to the targets and the standards that we're looking at. At the same time, we're making sure that we're benefiting residents, and then we're getting to this policy. Next slide. So you heard already about, you know, what are the ways that that we're looking at bringing down the fossil fuels. From the residents' side, these are the things that we're hearing. We're hearing that we want carbon reduction that improves air quality for residents. There's a lot of, so many stories of asthma, so many stories of kind of issues within the home where like people can literally smell fumes in their homes from boilers and such, concern about gas stoves, etc. We also heard that, you know, folks are really concerned about their energy bills, especially in the pandemic, right? Where you're stuck in your house, your energy bills are higher than usual, and it's a burden, right? So this really this really got to the piece of energy burden, right? And that idea that the more low-income folks end up with a higher percentage of their energy, having to pay for a higher percentage from their income for energy bills than people with higher incomes, right? So that was definitely an issue that came up, and folks were interested in not having super high energy bills. A third piece was displacement. There was concern that, you know, if things are too expensive, if upgrades happen, you know, are people going to have to be displaced? And so, you know, that was a really big concern that came up a lot. So we want to really make sure that we do think about how that's going to happen, how that's not going to happen, I mean. And there are, you know, various ways that we can make that not happen. And fourth, folks were interested in, you know, what it looks like from a building emissions perspective to actually improve heating and cooling in homes. You know, someone noted that their heat stays on all year, like in the summer too. And so understanding how many people have that sort of scenario happening is going to be important to see, to understand kind of the ways that building improvements in particular could have really, really lasting effects, not only for people, but also for the reduction of actual carbon. Folks are also really interested in, you know, if we're doing these improvements, are there jobs? How do we make sure that the jobs stay in communities, et cetera? And folks were interested in you know, not suffering the consequences of climate change and addressing you know, extreme heat and weather events that you know, Boston is preparing for. So those are the big things that came up and that we're trying to center in our process. Next slide, please. So this is just a recap of where we've been and where we're going. So first community meeting, July, just had our second community meeting, and then we're finishing up again November 16th. And folks that live in Boston are more than welcome to come. Kat has all of the information about that. Thanks, I think that's it.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. We did get a question asking about who is in the resident advisory group. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about who was invited and how that happened with the community partners.
Sure, absolutely. So our main lead is called ACE, Alternatives for Community and Environment. They are the primary environmental justice organization in Boston. They have pulled in City Life Vida Urbana and Chinese Progressive Association, and Kat, remind me the name of the last one.
It's New England United for Justice.
Thank you. I always mess up the the words in that one. And the reason that we picked those particular ones, in addition to them, you know, being able to hold the housing issues and the environmental justice issues, is that the largest buildings with residents are in Chinatown and also in Brighton. So they had bases that are particularly in those places.
Thank you. All right, so I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A. I'm gonna leave this slide and hang out here before we sort of go into breakout discussion instructions. So Allison, I wanted to ask if there are any sort of clarifying questions that we can tackle in the chat in addition to the one that we just answered.
Sure, we also had a question about the tag membership. I think that's a list we can provide.
Yeah, we can make sure to share that in the notes that we upload after the meeting.
And we have a question from Mike about district energy systems that the tag is looking at.
Philip, do you want to say a little bit more about?
And is the tag looking at district energy and geo waste, costs, and carbon potential?
Okay, you broke up a little bit, but what I understood was that somebody wanted to hear about the district energy and the tag and whether the tag technical advisory group was looking into geothermal and other types of district energy systems. So I'm going to throw that one over to Philip.
Sure, thank you. Mike, yes, we have been looking at, so we've been collecting data on existing district energy systems throughout the Boston area. And as you note, Veolia, which has now been purchased by Vicinity, and the Maytep systems are some of the largest ones. And we have been looking at case studies from throughout North America and Europe, primarily Northern Europe, for cities and industrial sectors and also campuses and hospitals that have low carbon district energy systems. So we pulled together 17 case studies from around the world, looking at different sources of heat that could be used in district energy systems, moving away from fossil fuels. And there's a lot of detail there, but I guess maybe if I can summarize at a high level, a lot of those case studies that we've looked at are using heat pumps to extract heat from other sources, such as ocean water or wastewater treatment plants, or waste heat from industrial processes, or some buildings that require cooling year-round. So you might have a data center that has a lot of computers that have to be kept cool year-round, and so there would be heat coming off of that cooling process that you could then capture and put into a district thermal system. So we have been doing some detailed evaluation of that on the technical advisory group. I'm happy to share any of that information that we pulled together if the city wants to connect me to you, or I can feed it through the city. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Philip. Allison, how about we take one more and then I'll go into the breakout discussion instructions.
Sure, we have several more. We can follow up with the rest. I'll pick one. What other policies have we looked at? New York, for example, has put a policy in place.
Absolutely. So we have been really watching closely what's been happening in other cities across the US. So New York City, Washington, DC, and St. Louis are 3 cities that have already passed ordinances and that are at varying points of the stage of implementation, developing regulations. We're also working with a whole cohort of cities that are working on developing performance standards across the US. So this is part of our Boston's participation in the American Cities Climate Challenge. So there's been a lot of co-learning with each other very early in the process. When we were doing the Climate Action Plan update, we reached out to New York City and sort of learned from their experience and have been having ongoing contact with them and other cities that have been doing this work. So lots of engagement behind the scenes. All right. So I think we're going to head into breakout discussions, and I know I can see the questions racking up. And so hopefully if you're in the extended technical analysis Q&A, you'll get answers to a lot of those questions, but otherwise we'll be saving the chat so we'll have a record of them and know and be able to follow up appropriately. Coming back, we're here. Remember to stretch. Depending on how your discussion went, y'all went into some pretty nerdy details. So now that you're here, please remember to select your language. Please select either English or Spanish. Por favor, recuerda seleccionar su idioma. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So I'm going to go over some next steps. So the next open house will take place. Oh, this is a little bit of an old one. My bad. The next open house should be taking place in November, not September. That's where you are now. And so we're going to keep taking what you've shared with us, and we're going to keep using that to keep shaping the structure of the next meeting. But as I shared earlier, we're going to be really diving into the policy details. The technical analysis will have been mostly wrapped up, and so we'll have a quick update from that, but we're really going to get into the policy next time. We're going to be sharing a survey after the meeting, as well as some of the pieces that people have requested, things like the list of members in the technical advisory group, and I'll share that after the meeting, probably at some point tomorrow because it's late at night. And we're going to continue to update our website with up-to-date information. So on our webpage, you can find the meeting recording, the notes, as well as the presentation slides if you want to take a little bit more time to sit with them. I know that we shared a lot of information and it was some dense technical stuff. All right. So before we leave you, I wanted to share a couple of events that are coming up. I'm sure many of you have registered for the event on Wednesday, which is being hosted by the Boston Planning and Development Agency, and all about zero net carbon building zoning. So this is another one of the really big strategies that we had included in the 2019 Climate Action Plan update. And this is the first event, so kicking off that process. And I can make sure to share the link to that event in the email that I send tomorrow as well. I also wanted to share that we have a couple of webinars coming up about energy justice and how to protect your electric account. So we have one tomorrow with Cantonese interpretation and another one on Thursday with Spanish interpretation, as well as a couple more with Vietnamese and Haitian Creole, ASL, American Sign Language, and CART enabled interpretation. So keep an eye out for those, and I'll make sure that those are links that are shared in the meeting and the post-meeting email as well. And so finally, I also wanted to acknowledge that we're still in COVID. If you need any information, you can head to our website. That's BOSTON.GOV/coronavirus. And then a plea to please fill out the 2020 census or ask everybody around you to do it. Boston is at 58%. We usually hit at least 60%. And that money is really important. It goes towards schools and transportation and housing and all things that we care about. So you can go to my2020census.gov. And so that concludes our program for tonight. We wanted to get y'all out bright and early at 7:24 p.m. But finally, just a really big thank you for taking time out of your Monday evening to join us for this second open house.